Horrible realities of being a woman. Throughout history, women have faced systemic injustices and lived under harsh realities dictated by patriarchal systems. Their struggles, rights, and triumphs were often erased or ignored in mainstream historical narratives, making it even more critical to shed light on their experiences. This video will take you through key moments, practices, and events in history when being a woman was synonymous with surviving unimaginable hardships. Together, we will expose the inequities of the past to appreciate the progress made and to understand the battles still being fought today. In ancient societies, patriarchal structures were foundational, and laws were written with the explicit aim of subjugating women. For example, the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest known collections of laws from ancient Mesopotamia, treated women as property. Marriage was transactional, and a woman's value was often tied to her dowry, her ability to bear children, and her obedience to her husband. In ancient Greece, women were excluded from meaningful participation in politics or philosophy, barred from citizenship, and confined to the home. Although there were exceptions, such as the Spartan culture where women had some privileges, these were rare. Roman society similarly limited women's autonomy, often seeing them as vessels to secure lineage and property inheritance. Even in more progressive ancient cultures, such as Egypt, power exercised by women like Cleopatra was the exception rather than the norm. This foundational inequality created a legacy that would influence gender roles for centuries. Women's exclusion from education, leadership, and autonomy ensured that their voices would remain relegated to the margins of historical accounts. The oppression of women's rights extended into cultural and social structures. Forced marriages were commonplace and legitimized across civilizations, often happening when girls were mere children. These practices deprived women of basic autonomy, tying their futures to decisions made by others, usually men. Inheritance laws solidified male dominance over resources like land and wealth. While men inherited estates that kept power consolidated within patriarchal structures, women were often allowed little more than personal belongings. In many societies, these norms were enforced not only by laws, but also by oppressive social expectations that pressured women into compliance. Moreover, cultural practices reinforced stereotypes that idealized submissiveness and discouraged rebellion. Women were expected to be silent, obedient, and confined to the domestic sphere, a recurring theme that echoed across different regions and eras. During the medieval era, women faced some of the darkest and most horrifying injustices in recorded history. Feudalism, a dominant societal structure, relegated women to the lowest rungs of the social ladder. Their labor and lives were deemed dispensable and subject to the whims of feudal lords. A particularly grim episode in this period was the witch trials across Europe and in the Americas. Accusations of witchcraft were primarily leveled at women, often as a tool of control or out of fear of female independence. The criteria for identifying witches were arbitrary, and the punishments, burning, drowning, and torture, were unimaginably cruel. These trials stemmed from misogyny intertwined with superstition, where women were demonized for characteristics like assertiveness, knowledge of herbal medicine, or even being widowed. Religion was often weaponized to further suppress women during this period. Across Christian and Islamic territories alike, patriarchal interpretations of Scripture were used to justify oppressive restrictions on women's mobility, autonomy, and rights. The Industrial Revolution marked a shift in economic structures but carried forward the same oppressive treatment of women. It was a time of widespread exploitation, and women found themselves working long hours as cheap labor in factories. Their wages were significantly lower than men's, even though the working conditions were just as grueling, often more so. The danger of workplaces like textile mills posed a dual threat to women: physical harm due to unregulated safety standards, and the persistent harassment by male supervisors. Many young women lacked alternative choices, becoming trapped in these roles due to societal and economic constraints that limited their avenues for education or better employment. The industrial era's inequalities also bled into domestic life. Women often worked outside the home only to return and carry the bulk of household responsibilities, reinforcing their double burden. While this period saw the early rumblings of feminist movements, the economic exploitation of women remained unchecked for decades. Throughout history, certain cultural practices institutionalized violence against women under the guise of tradition or social order. These practices were not only painful and dehumanizing, but also mechanisms to maintain control over women's bodies and lives. One such custom was foot binding in Imperial China, a practice that persisted for almost 1,000 years. Considered a marker of beauty and refinement, it required young girls to have their feet painfully bound, deforming them to fit societal ideals. Women with bound feet were often immobilized, ensuring their dependence on male relatives and reinforcing their subjugation. Another egregious example is female genital mutilation, FGM, practiced in various regions around the world. This cultural ritual, often touted as a rite of passage, caused immense pain, medical complications, and lasting trauma. It was designed to control women's sexuality and enforce societal ideas of purity. Similar forms of oppression were visible in practices like honor-based violence, where women were punished, sometimes fatally, for perceived slights against familial or community norms. These acts were justified under the guise of preserving tradition, but the real motive was the perpetuation of male control. Throughout history and across cultures, systemic violence against women has been a grim constant. During conflicts, sexual violence against women was wielded as a weapon of war, designed to demoralize communities and assert dominance. Examples range from the sieges of ancient cities to conflicts as recent as the 20th century Balkan Wars. Legal structures also promoted systemic injustice. Coverture laws in Western nations stripped married women of independent legal identities, consolidating all property and decision-making rights under their husbands. Even domestic violence was often considered a private matter, leaving women without recourse or protection from abuse. Women's disenfranchisement from political structures further perpetuated their marginalization. Until the 19th and 20th centuries, women were almost universally denied the right to vote or hold political office, ensuring their exclusion from the decisions that governed their lives. Education and knowledge have always been powerful tools, but history shows that societies deliberately excluded women from accessing them. In the ancient and medieval eras, formal education, scholarly pursuits, and scientific inquiry were reserved for men. Women's knowledge, particularly in areas like medicine and midwifery, was either devalued or vilified. Those who deviated from societal norms were often demonized. Think of the witch hunts, where women who possessed herbal knowledge were persecuted. Despite these barriers, women resisted. Figures like Hypatia of Alexandria in the ancient world and Christine de Pizan during the Renaissance fought fiercely for women's intellectual inclusion. Feminist movements advocating for girls' education gained momentum in the 19th century, but prior to that, access to knowledge had been jealously guarded as a tool to maintain male dominance. The horrific realities women faced in the past resonate strongly with struggles in the present. While much progress has been made, global issues like the gender wage gap, reproductive rights battles, and the prevalence of gender-based violence show that the fight for equality is far from over. Many modern challenges have deep roots in historical injustices. For example, women's exclusion from economic ownership in the past continues to influence their representation in global wealth today. Cultural practices, though officially outlawed in many cases, persist in shadowy corners of society, leaving no room for complacency. Even as women break barriers across fields, from politics to science, systemic obstacles erected over centuries remind us that progress often comes in incremental steps rather than sweeping reforms. The feminist movement of today is, in many ways, a continuation of the resilience and resistance shown by the women who fought for their rights across history. Reflecting on the horrors of the past is not just an exercise in recounting tragedy, it's a call to action. The women who endured forced marriages, systemic violence, and legal marginalization paved the way for progress through their perseverance and sacrifice. Understanding the past is crucial for challenging and dismantling systems that perpetuate inequality today. Every battle fought, from securing voting rights to breaking professional barriers, was built on a foundation of historical struggle. In moving forward, we must honor the lives and stories of the women who came before us. By amplifying these truths, we create space for solidarity and advocacy, ensuring that future generations don't face the same horrors. Together, we can celebrate progress while committing to the ongoing fight for gender justice, a fight rooted in history but driven by hope for a better, more equitable world. Don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more exciting videos like this.